Okay. Good evening, everybody. I am Amy Rowe with Rutgers Cooperative Extension. We would like to welcome you to Earth Day Every Day, and this is the start of our special mini series called Earth Day in the City. So we're going to focus on some urban issues with Michele Bakacs kicking us off today with safe soil and urban gardening. Then we'll have combined sewer overflows. We'll have wildlife in the city. We're also going to have salt and its environmental impacts. So that's our mini urban part of this series. So thank you for joining us today. So we will be talking about safe soils and urban gardening in a minute, but I have some logistics to go through. So you guys are all muted. If you have questions, please use your chat box, which is at the bottom of your Zoom window. There's a little chat bubble. Just click on that and you can send comments or questions directly to me and I will relay them to our speaker. So don't be shy. We will get to questions. Don't feel like you're being lost in the void. We will get to the questions and our speaker will get to individual questions and site-specific things down the road if you want to contact her after the fact. But yeah, we're going to try to get to as many questions as possible. So thank you for that. Go ahead, Michele.
Sorry.
Maybe.
Yeah.
Okay, so some more logistics and details. Towards the end of this talk, we will be giving you a poll to see what you learned, what you knew before you came to this presentation, and what you will be undertaking in your neighborhood or in your backyard or in your city. So we need to follow some Rutgers regulations when we are using people and getting people's opinions. So this is consent, and this is all the information about this research study. It is research because we are asking you questions and we are collecting that information. It will be anonymous and you can withdraw your consent down the road if you choose not to participate. And so at the time when we have the poll, you will be asked if you consent to participate. So please keep that in mind. If you need this information, you can contact me directly, Amy Rowe. You see my info here, and there is no detriment to not taking part in our survey. It's really just to improve the program and to see how we're doing. So no harm, no foul if you don't want to participate, but we would really appreciate your feedback. So keep that in mind. Go ahead, next slide.
Okay. Not sure
Okay, no worries. So also Rutgers Cooperative Extension provides programming to people of all races, all colors, all accommodations. And so please keep that in mind that this is an equal opportunity program provider and we do not discriminate. This is in accordance with federal law and with the U.S. Department of Agriculture, who provides funding for Rutgers Cooperative Extension. So please be aware that we allow all people to participate in our programs. And if you have any questions, you can look at this website here, or you could talk to the Rutgers Cooperative Extension Director directly at this phone number. So go ahead, Michele. All right. Well, without further ado, also, just so you know, this program is being recorded. It will be available later on our website. I will put it in the chat so you can get to it. Obviously, we need to finish the program before the recording is available. You wouldn't believe how many people ask me for the recording before the presentation has occurred. But please check out our website. There's lots of cool information and all of our past webinars recordings are up there as well. Thanks to Michele here. So now it is my distinct pleasure to welcome one of our core team members and one of my favorite colleagues. Michele Bakacs is with Rutgers Cooperative Extension of Middlesex and Union Counties. She is an alumni of Rutgers, and she is focusing on all kinds of things in her education and outreach. She does native plants. She does the safe soils and urban gardening. She is the director of the Rutgers Environmental Stewards Program. So she is into all kinds of things, but like I said, today she's going to focus on our Earth Day every day in the city, safe soils for urban gardening. So thanks for stepping up, Michelle, and I'll leave it to you.
No problem. Thank you, Amy. You hear me okay? I sound okay. All right, guys, welcome. Thanks for joining us this evening. We're excited about Earth Day every day in the city. Tonight, we're going to be talking about an issue that I had worked on a lot in the city of New Brunswick, soil contamination and urban gardening. So the objective of this presentation is to give you just an overview of the issues surrounding soil contamination and urban gardens. The reality is we live in New Jersey, and New Jersey has an urban industrial legacy, and that means a lot of our more urban areas, Newark, Trenton, Camden, Patterson, a lot of Essex County, the soil can be contaminated with lead. So that is something that has to be dealt with when people are gardening and growing food. With that said, though, this topic, sometimes people come to it a little bit wary, maybe a little bit scared. I want to assure you right from the very beginning that although we're talking about contamination, there is gardening on urban soil is one of the best things that you can do to reduce risk of exposure to contamination and to improve that soil. So I just want to say that from the outset, that there's few situations that you may find yourself in an urban area that you might not be able to, improve that soil and do all the good stuff that gardening does, so that you can safely, you, your family, your community can safely garden on a site. And that's what we're going to talk about tonight. How can we do this safely and successfully? Okay, so here is the outline of what we're going to talk about this evening. I'm going to give you all the resources that I really like. This is not an area of expertise for me. I sort of fell into it because folks, the stakeholders in the city of New Brunswick asked me to help them with this issue. If you've been to New Brunswick, you know that there's a large immigrant community from Mexico and other areas, but there's large Spanish-speaking community, and a lot of gardening goes on in the city of New Brunswick, as does in many of our urban communities. But folks that were living there did not necessarily know that they needed to test their soil, especially for lead. So we developed a program there to reach out to the Spanish-speaking community and help them test their soil. When I was figuring out what we needed to do, a lot of these resources can come from that time. So I'm going to share with you my favorite resources. We'll talk about how does soil become contaminated. Talk about the concept of bioavailability, which is a very, very important concept to understand when it comes to understanding how to reduce your risk of lead exposure. And then we are going to focus in on lead. Usually this talk is a 3-hour lecture where we talk about all different types of heavy metals and other contaminants. Today, we're just going to focus in on lead because that's where the human health concern is. We'll talk about sources of lead, why we should care, soil testing, and best practices and remediation practices. Okay, so first, I want to let you know that, did you know that there are almost no soil testing requirements for growing food? When I first started getting involved with this, that surprised me. Maybe it surprises you also. There are other soil testing requirements. If a site is a brownfield, if there's known or suspected contamination on a site, and someone buys it and they want to redevelop that site into a residential site, maybe an industrial, commercial site, then there are soil testing requirements that have to be done to get that property up to snuff. So there are soil testing requirements so that a site can be, so a residential development can be built on it. There's also soil testing requirements, if a farmer wants to use sewage sludge on their farm. But other than that, there's not a ton of soil testing requirements specifically for growing food. So in absence of that, when I say no soil testing requirements, I mean states and the federal government don't really require it. So in absence of that, cities all over the United States have developed their own requirements and their own soil testing requirements to be able to advise their residents on how people should be testing their soil in urban communities. So New York City has it, Philadelphia has it, Boston has them. But I'm going to talk to you now about some of my favorite resources. The one on the left is from the EPA, Brownfields and Urban Agriculture, Interim Guidelines for Safe Gardening Practices. This document is actually it's quite a few years old at this point, but it's an overview document, and that's the website there. It's an overview document that basically gives the current state of our understanding of safe gardening practices in urban communities. And then the one on the right is I mentioned already that there are cities that have developed their own guidelines. This one is my favorite. It's actually from Toronto in Canada, From the Ground Up Guide for Soil Testing in Urban Gardens. It has a really nice decision tree, and then another great supplemental document that kind of explains how they came to this. So I really like these two documents, and then I have some others for you. Again, this presentation is based on my experience working in this area, and then all of these resources that I'm showing you now. So for example, Rutgers has this fact sheet, Lead Contaminated Soil, Minimizing Health Risks. So that's fact sheet 336. So that's the website. You can look on our publications website and download that fact sheet. And that was written by a couple of soil experts at Rutgers, including Stephanie Murphy, who runs the Rutgers Soil Testing Lab. And then this one I wrote with a coworker, Meredith Melendez, Food Safety, Soil and Water Testing Recommendations for School and Community Gardens. That's a Bolton 3550. And then Cornell is the Land Grant Institute for New York State, and they have a wonderful, wonderful program called Healthy Soils, Healthy Communities, where they really have done tons of research and have some great resources on soil contamination and gardening. The reason why is because about 5 or 6 years ago now, New York City was in the news quite a bit because testing was done on some of their community gardens in New York City, and soil was found to be higher than it should be for lead. So they've done some really great research and have come out with some good standards for what to compare your results to when testing. Okay, let's move on. We all know the benefits of gardening and benefits of gardening in the city. There are many of them, right? They beautify vacant properties. Gardening helps to beautify vacant properties. It increases a sense of community. People come together in community gardens. There's research that shows that gardening in the city, urban agriculture, increases property values. And then also these gardens, urban gardens help to infiltrate rainwater and stormwater runoff. So they kind of act like sponges, soaking up excess rainwater runoff. They improve air quality, increase biodiversity of pollinator habitat, reduce waste. And my favorite is they often expose children to growing food and fresh produce. I have 2 boys, and I'm always looking to do that. But the reality is that there is a risk to gardening or farming on a in an urban area on a formally developed sites. And one of those risks is that the soil may be contaminated. Those risks increase in older, more urban developed areas with a legacy of industry, high traffic areas, or older homes. And what this chart here shows for different land uses, and land uses are literally how the land is used, some common contaminants associated with these different land uses. So for example, on a former agricultural land, sometimes you have pesticides or herbicides or even lead arsenic in the soil. So for example, on old orchards, lead arsenate was used as an insecticide. And then arsenic was used as a preservative in wood so that the wood would not rot. So often you see that in urban areas. You see a lot of times we're testing for lead and we're testing for arsenic. On old industrial sites, often there's asbestos, petroleum products, lead paint, solvents, and something called polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. It's a common urban pollutant in the soil. And then there are on old commercial properties like gas stations or dry cleaners, sometimes you have metals, solvents, petroleum products, or surfactants, residual materials that are again left in the soil. And then this isn't a land use, but maybe if you've bought a new home, maybe you had an issue with underground or leaking storage tanks, and there could potentially, if it's leaking, there could be petroleum products in the soil. On older residential properties, you may have lead-based paint, asbestos. We're going to talk about this more. We're going to take a deeper dive into lead. And then anywhere where you have high trafficked areas or older roadways, often you have, again, those hydrocarbons, the PAHs, and the lead in the soil. So this is just kind of a smattering of what could happen. And so we're going to take a little bit deeper dive in a second into lead. So in New Jersey, I wanted to note that this when we're talking about, obviously, has heavily impacts on urban areas in New Jersey. And I just was reading this article yesterday, which you have access to. It's in a journal called Soil Systems. It's online. And this is research that was done by some researchers at Rutgers, Newark. Soil lead concentration and speciation in community farms of Newark in New Jersey. So farmed urban soils often bear legacies of historic contamination from anthropogenic and industrial sources. But what I highlighted here in blue is really kind of the whole point of this presentation, which is, and you can read this journal article on your own and go through the results, but in the abstract here, it says overall results showed that the lowest concentrations of lead, and PB is the symbol for lead, are detected. For them, it was detected, the lowest concentrations were detected in their raised beds, whereas uncultivated native soil and parking lot samples had the highest values of lead. So I'm kind of giving away the farm here. My point is just that gardening on an urban site is one of the best things that you can do to reduce risk and to improve lead levels at a site. Okay, so I also want to make sure to cover, and that everyone understands this concept of bioavailability, because just testing for lead and getting your lead results back is not enough. There's some other variables that you need to know about. And I'm not just talking about lead, I'm talking about arsenic, I'm talking about other heavy metals also. So let's define our terms. Bioavailability is a contaminant's ability to cause a direct impact or a direct effect on humans, on plants and animals, because it can be taken up or it can be absorbed by their bodies. And lots of things impact the bioavailability of a contaminant, and we're going to talk about those. So this is a very important concept to understand, because just because, for example, the lead levels may be high in the soil, it does not necessarily mean that that particular contaminant is bioavailable. It does not necessarily mean that it can be absorbed by the body or by the plant. So when, for example, the Rutgers lab does testing for lead, they are measuring the total concentration of lead in the soil. And that's typically what your results are, what you're going to get back, the total concentration. That does not tell you the bioavailable portion of lead in the soil. The total concentration is done with an extract. It's actually an acid that they use to extract the lead. So that does not tell you the bioavailable portion. So what you also need to know when you do your testing, there are some other factors that influence bioavailability. The pH of the soil is very important. So hopefully you remember what pH is. pH is a measure of acidity, okay? So it's important to know what the soil acidity is. And acidity and pH is measured on a scale. It's measured on a scale from 0 to 14, with 7 right in the middle being neutral. So anything below 7 is considered to be acidic, right? Anything above 7 is considered to be more alkaline. The more acidic the soil, like below 6, below 5.5, the more bioavailable the contaminant will be. For example, lead or arsenic. So that's really important. Organic matter, the amount of organic matter in the soil can also impact the bioavailability of the contaminant, for example, lead or arsenic. The more organic matter that's in the soil, the more that organic matter will bind to the lead, and it's going to lock up that lead. For example, it's going to lock up that arsenic so that it will not be made available to the plant, or if it's ingested, it won't be absorbed into our body. So hopefully you're starting to kind of understand why gardening is so great when it comes to a contaminated site. And then soil texture and clay content is really important. Clay will also help to bind the lead in the soil, lock up that lead in the soil. And then phosphorus will bind with, for example, will bind with lead and will form something called lead phosphate, and will lock up that lead in the soil, so it's not bioavailable. So what do we do when we garden? We add organic matter, right? We add compost. We are correcting for our soil pH. We like it in that kind of what I call the happy zone, which is about 6.5. You want to keep your soil at about a 6.5. That's important because that's when plants can most efficiently absorb nutrients from the soil for most of the plants that you're going to be growing in your garden. That doesn't count like blueberries and some of the things that like it more the plants that like it more acidic, but your tomatoes and your peppers and your spinach and stuff like that, they prefer around 6.5. So all of these things that we're doing to the soil are great for kind of locking up lead, locking up arsenic, and making it so that it's not bioavailable. This picture that I'm showing you here was developed by the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences, both University of North Carolina and University of Arizona, and that's available online. That's a great fact sheet that they wrote, showing the importance of understanding bioavailability. Okay, questions. I know that was a lot that I wrote. Any questions, Amy?
So nothing's come through.
Okay, that's okay. We will have
I
another
don't know
opportunity.
if people are shy or if we need
That's okay.
somebody
We'll have,
to.
I'll keep going, and then I'll have another opportunity to ask questions. Feel free to put the questions in the chat. Okay, so now we're going to dive into a little bit more into lead. So lead is often the one that we are most concerned with because of the human health concern. So where does lead come from? Lead was in paint up until, I believe, the late 1970s. So very often older homes, homes built before the 1980s, oftentimes around the drip line of the house, the soil right next to the house can often be have higher lead levels than normal. By the way, lead is our most common urban contaminant. It's a poisonous metal, but it's found actually naturally in the soil at low levels below 100 parts per million, but often in urban areas, it's above that. So chip paint, for example, in this picture here on the upper part of the screen, if you have a fence that was painted with lead-based paint, then those chips are going to get in the soil and it's going to increase the lead content of the soil. And then lead was also in gasoline up until the early 1980s. That's why when you go and pump gas, it says unleaded gasoline. So oftentimes along roadways, right next to the road, that's when you'll find the highest concentrations of lead. And then industry was also a source of lead. For example, US Metals was a company in Carteret. It was a smelting plant. And at the height of their operations, it's something like 500,000 tons per year of metal was being smelted at that plant. And so all of that lead, you had all this air pollution, and a lot of that lead settled in the surrounding residential areas in their yards. And actually in about 2017, there was a 7.4 Carteret, there was a $7.4 million settlement between Carteret and US Metals. You can read about that if you look that up. But that's an example of industrial lead pollution. Okay, so why are we so concerned about lead? It's not because the plants are not very likely to absorb lead. The problem is actually dust and soil that can stick to the plants or to your hands or toys and other objects. And it can especially harm children. Children are at the greatest risk for lead poisoning. Like you see in these pictures here, children often play in the soil or the dirt, and dust gets on their toys, which they put in their mouths. So lead causes a huge problem, a neurological problem, and can affect fine and gross motor skills. Exposure to lead, even at low levels, is associated with decreased hearing, lower intelligence, hyperactivity, attention deficits, and developmental problems that make it very difficult for these children to learn. In the body, when lead is ingested, lead acts like calcium, and it's actually absorbed into the neurons. It kind of replaces calcium and absorbed into the neurons. And then it also can be absorbed into the bone. And over time, your own bones can become a source of lead in the body. So it's really a long-term problem. So by law, children must have a blood test for lead at least once before they turn 6. So when my kids turned actually 2, their pediatrician gave us a script for us to have their lead tests done. And the Center for Disease Control and Prevention considers 5 micrograms per deciliter of whole blood to be the reference level. It used to be 10. It's actually been lowered to 5. And this is important because there is no known use of lead in the body. There's no safe level of lead. So there's no reason that we should have 5 micrograms per deciliter of lead in the body. So at that point, that's when, it's kind of a trigger. That's when something should be done. So you can have a child tested at a doctor's office, or the county health departments will also do it for free. So you can look, there's a report that's put out by the State Department of Health every 2 years. The Childhood Lead Poisoning in New Jersey report comes out. And I've been looking at that report for about 10 years now. It comes out every 2 years. And this is one of the charts that one of the graphs that I often look at. These are the top 5 large municipalities with the highest percentage of children less than 6 years of age with an EBLL, an elevated blood lead level. This is for 2019. This is the last annual report that came out. So another one will come out in 2021. So based on the information that they collected in 2019, East Orange has the highest percentage, followed by Trenton, Atlantic City, Irvington, and West Orange. This is the first time I have not seen Newark on here. Newark has the largest population under 6 years of age. Theirs was close to 4%, but they used to be the highest. For years, they were the highest. So you can dive a little bit more into that information by downloading this report, the Childhood Lead Poisoning report. So let's some things to understand about lead in soil. As I said earlier, often it's the highest, closest to buildings and closest to streets. So that's important, right? So that's a good idea to think about that when you are trying to figure out where to put your garden, right? If you don't, a lot of times people, especially in urban areas, they are gardening right next to the foundation of the home. So you absolutely should get your soil tested there for lead. And if it's high, we'll talk about some things that you can do. Again, the most heavy metals are tightly bound to soil particles and not taken up by the plants themselves. We talked about this already, or a little bit already, when we talked about bioavailability. Most heavy metals want to stay tightly bound to the soil. It's very difficult for a plant to actually absorb lead. There has to be very specific conditions in order for it to happen. It has to be very acidic. It has to have low organic, soil has to be acidic and have low organic matter and low nutrients. And typically when you're gardening, that's just not the case. And then lastly, as I already said, the most serious exposure is through direct ingestion of soil and dust, not through plant uptake. Okay. So let's talk about soil testing, and then I think I'm going to have another opportunity for questions. So you can easily have your soil tested for lead, and I'm going to talk to you about 2 different ways. If you are at home and you want to get your soil tested for lead, and that's what we did, what my husband and I did when we first bought our house and we wanted to put in a garden, we tested our soil and we included lead in the soil test. You can purchase a soil test kit at your county extension office. Every county in the state has a Rutgers Cooperative Extension office. And then you can get, it's really nice, a soil test kit. And so everything comes already done. The mailer, it comes with the mailer, it comes with the plastic bags, it comes with the instructions. But if you don't want to go to the office, your extension office, that's okay. You can just go do a search for the Rutgers Soil Testing Laboratory. You can just download the questionnaire. They call it a questionnaire. It's a form. They call it a questionnaire. And then just use some Ziploc bags and you mail the sample with the pay. You fill out the form, you mail your sample with the payment to the lab, and you would get your results in a few weeks, depending upon the time of year that you're doing it. Okay, so let's talk about how we take a test, soil test for lead. So this is important. If you are sampling, if you want to do your sample at wherever you're doing your sample, if you're doing it in your raised beds, if you're doing it in your yard, for example, we did our front yard, we did a soil test in our front yard, and we did a soil test in our backyard. Those would be 2 different samples. And what you're going to do is you're going to take a composite sample approach. And what all that means is that you're going to get a trowel and you're going to get a bucket and you're going to go around your yard and you're going to insert your trowel into the soil to a depth of about 3 inches. You don't want to go deeper than that. And the reason why is because when lead settles on the soil, it doesn't migrate down. It stays in the top 3 inches of soil. If you have already worked the soil and you've rototilled it or you've dug it quite a bit, then you can go deeper. But if you haven't done anything to soil, then you just concentrate in the top 2 to 3 inches of soil. And so you want to do that. You want to take what's called a subsoil in different places in the yard, all in a random fashion. You're getting a representative soil from that whole area. So you go around the yard, you take about 10 to 12 what's called subsamples. You put those in the bucket, and then you mix it up really, really well, like you're mixing a cake, like you're combining the sugar and you're combining the flour. Mix it up really, really well. And then all you need to send to the lab is about a cup and a half of soil. And that one soil sample represents that whole part of the yard. Okay, so these are what the results look like. So when you get your soil test results back from the lab, they will send you, they will tell you the pH or the acidity of the soil, and that's on the left here. And if it's low, if it's above 6, you want to check to see, okay, what was my lead level? And that's here. And you're going to look where it says EPA estimated PB. And again, PB stands for lead. And if it's above 400 parts per million, it's considered to be unsafe for growing food. So even if it's like between 300 to 400, that's still actually considered to be significantly contaminated. And you absolutely would want to do something. You would want to add soil amendments. You would want to do something for that soil. But if it's above 400 parts per million, you have to do something with that soil. You can use raised beds. I will talk to you about a bunch of other things that you can do on the site to make it safe. Okay, so that's what the soil test results look like. Now, if you're with a community or school garden, or if you're with an urban farm, you can go through that process. You can use the Rutgers Soil Testing Laboratory, but also know that there's another service available to you through the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service. They will test a community or school garden for heavy metal contamination for free. So they will come to your site and they will bring with them a very wonderful piece of equipment called an XRF analyzer. On the left here, this gentleman all the way on the left, his name is Edwin Muniz. And this is us doing some soil sampling in New Brunswick, on some gardens in New Brunswick. That's the XRF analyzer. It basically looks like a gun. It has a laser and they shoot it at the soil and you get instantaneous results. So you will know immediately your results. And then they also send you a report and they give you all the GPS points of where they did the sampling. And then if you're at a school or community garden, you can keep that report on file and you can keep the report that Rutgers gives you on file so folks know when the soil testing happens. Okay, any questions?
So some people had asked some questions about East Orange and West Orange and why they are having such high lead levels. And I know for a fact that there are a lot of older homes in those cities and they probably were never inspected for lead paint. And I'm pretty sure that it's the lead paint rather than an industrial cause or anything like that. And I apologize, my camera is not working at the moment, so sorry about that.
That's okay. If I could just add, if you were in Essex County, you should be testing your soil for lead. I used to kind of beat around I used to, the Master Gardener Coordinator, Jan Zintek, he makes a point every year of telling this to the Master Gardener interns, that if you are in Essex County, you absolutely should be testing your soil for lead. And it's exactly what Amy said. It's because those are a lot of older urban homes and heavily used streets.
Okay, there was another question about PFAS, PFAS in soils. Are you familiar with that contaminant, Michelle?
Oh my goodness, it's slipping my mind what it stands for.
Yeah, It's polyfluoroalkyl substances.
Yeah, I'm not as familiar with that in soils.
Yeah, so those have been found in soil. I did answer this question in the chat, but I think
Okay, great.
it would benefit everyone. So those
Yes,
have
please.
been found in soil.
Yeah.
This group of substances is used in many different things: food packaging, cookware, fire repellents like extinguishers and things like that. Almost everyone in the US has been exposed to PFAS. And so those are found in the soil. In general, the levels of contamination are fairly low unless there was an industrial accident or some kind of factory or those kinds of things. But yes, those PFAS substances are in soil, they're in the air, they are persistent in the environment, which means that they don't break down. And so they can be a long-term problem. But yeah, we may need to consider having a whole webinar about that. So I don't
Sure.
want to derail this, but
Right.
thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah, were there other questions?
That's all I had here.
Okay. Okay, so then moving on. Okay, so if you are growing vegetables, fruit, food known to have in soil that's known to have elevated lead levels, if you're in a community that you just know that lead levels have been high, then these are some things that you should be thinking about. Now we're getting into the best practices part of the presentation. If you are, the best option is to grow in raised beds, like you see here, and bring in soil. And if you have had your soil tested and it's shown to be high, but the reality is that, you know, maybe that is just not possible for you. Maybe you are growing at a site where you're renting and your landlord will not let you build raised beds. Maybe you are in a situation where you want to use the entire area. You want to use the native soil. And I've worked with a lot of urban gardeners that just don't want to use raised beds because they feel that it's limiting and they want to maximize the amount of area that they can grow in. What I recommend, and what a lot of the guidance recommends, is to grow crops that have the least risk of contamination. And those are your fruiting crops. For example, your tomatoes, your chilies, your peppers, eggplant, squash. The reason why is because it is unlikely that if the lead is absorbed into the plant, it's very, very unlikely that it's going to get all the way up into the fruit. Plants that have a higher risk of contamination are ones that grow low to the ground and would be exposed because of either splashback when watering or through direct uptake. So these are your leafy greens where you're eating the leaf itself, your herbs and your root crops, for example, cilantro, spinach, kale, partially, and then radishes and carrots. They're in direct contact with the soil. So that's where you may have some absorption. So you want to think about this if you're gardening in an urban area in a known contaminated area. A note about more information on raised beds. A note about raised beds. Just because you build raised beds does not mean that those raised beds cannot be recontaminated. And there was a great article that was great research that was done in Roxbury, Massachusetts, which is kind of the hotbed for soil gardening contamination research. And you can read that journal article in the journal Environmental Research. In Roxbury, the researchers went around to community gardens and measured the lead levels over 4 years. And initially, the range was 150 parts per million. And over 4 years, it went up each year to an average of 336 parts per million. So the article said note that constructing raised beds with clean material will help create healthy gardens, but may not eliminate airborne contaminants or soil dust and splashback from other areas. So that's really important to think about. If you're building raised beds, there is the potential for recontamination, and you need to protect your beds, okay? That is the best thing that you could do. If you build raised beds, if you bring in your special mushroom compost or whatever it is that you brought in, you need to make sure to cover your beds in the winter when they don't have plants on them. And then in the spring, you can scrape off like the top 1 centimeter of soil if you don't have them covered. But that is something to think about, that beds can be recontaminated. So these are just some sites that we worked on in New Brunswick. On the left here was before this woman was gardening in her backyard. Lead levels were high, and we had some funding from the EPA Environmental Justice Grant. We built raised beds, but then this was a situation on the bottom here where this resident did not want raised beds. So in this case, we brought in a lot of compost. We added lime to the soil. We incorporated that into the soil so that to lock up the lead in the soil and to reduce the risk of exposure that way. And this is what it looked like a year later. She really did grow like an urban farm in her backyard. So other best practices, and these are also all common sense practices that people are already doing. This is the kind of the part of the presentation where, I don't know, I usually sort of pause for a second. I am well aware that some of you may be working in schools or in community gardens and working with kids. And the whole idea of getting them in the garden is to expose them to fresh fruit and vegetables and getting them to work the soil and smell the soil and interact with nature and to, you know, pick a fresh cherry tomato off the vine. So I am aware of that, and I would just say that in the urban areas, these are some things that you just need to think about. For example, kids should be using gloves. Parents should be using gloves. Of course, you should be washing your hands afterwards. Keeping fingernail shorts is very important, especially on kids because they bite their nails and soil gets under the nails. Washing vegetables and herbs carefully. You can even use a dilute vinegar solution. So making sure to get all that dust and all that grime off of the vegetables or the fruit. Making sure to peel root crops and removing the outer leaves of leafy crops, for example, cabbages. And then this is something I saw a lot where there's a lot of dirt, especially in backyard gardens, a lot of dirt being tracked into the house. Making sure to keep shoes outdoors, do not wear them in the house, and also not tracking dust and dirt indoors and using a wet mop. Because the issue is that all these things, they seem small and insignificant, but if you are living in an urban area where there's known soil contamination and lead is an issue, you know, a child, for example, may be exposed to it through the soil. Possibly there's lead in the home for lead pipes. I'm sorry, from lead paint. So there's all this potential risk from different sources. Some other best management practices: testing your soil, testing for lead, as I said, or the organic matter and pH. The Rutgers Soil Testing Lab also does organic matter. And also building raised beds and bringing in soil. If raised beds are impractical, then you want to focus on immobilizing that lead in the soil. So if your soil test results come back in the range of 150 to 400 parts per million, then you want to mend the soil with compost. And you're going to till a lot of compost. You're going to till about 3 inches of compost into the soil, into about 6 inches of soil. And then you're going to make sure to correct your pH, add limestone based on the soil test to keep that pH within the happy zone. And then also, if it comes back higher than that, between 400 to 1,000 parts per million, in addition to those other practices that I mentioned, you want to apply phosphorus. You want to apply about 11 pounds of phosphorus per 100 square feet and till that into the soil. And that's important because there's a lot of good research that shows that lead will combine with phosphorus and form lead phosphate, and it will lock it up. The phosphorus will lock it up into the soil so that it's not as bioavailable. And then you want to test the soil annually because the phosphorus especially has a tendency to reduce the soil pH. So you want to make sure that that pH stays where it should be. Some other thing, learn your site's history and understand your neighborhood. Know where you are living. Know if you are in a community that has a history of lead contamination in the soil. Build gardens away from roads and old buildings. Make sure to control dust because studies show that the main contamination transportation mechanism is wind. And then really important, in an urban garden, cover walkways with mulch or landscape fabric like you see in this picture here. This is another garden in New Brunswick, and see how they've, in between all of the beds here, they have a couple of inches of wood chips and mulch that they've put down. These are some other great resources here. So Brownfields and Urban Agriculture from the EPA. This is another document. This material is available in Spanish if you need it. The document is called Tierra Inacua. That's available on the Rutgers website. It's publication E342. And then that's it. I'm happy to take any more questions that have come through.
Okay, Michelle, thank you. Before we take questions, I'm going to start the poll. So please answer these questions so we can make this program better and see what you've learned. We'll give you a couple minutes while we are answering questions. So I have launched that. Please make sure you submit once you have finished the poll. And now on to some questions. So Michelle, thank you. That was a very nice conversation. And here I have a question for raised beds. Is packaged soil free of all of these contaminants?
Yeah, not necessarily. So bagged soil, you also have to be careful what you get. We typically recommend getting if you're going to get bagged soil, to make sure you get organic soil. There is no soil police. So, and a lot of times when you look at the soil, it's actually biosolids. So that means that it's coming from a treatment facility. So you do want to be careful when it comes to what you buy at your local home center. Try to get an organic soil. If you're dealing with, a lot of times you can go to a local nursery or supplier and you want to ask them if the soil has been tested. If they're working at a community garden, for example, or a school garden, ask them if the soil has been tested. But the answer is no, not necessarily. The bagged soil, there's often, it's unclear what it is that you're getting.
Okay, thank you. Then there's another question that if you have your soil, your topsoil in your site, and then you put down a bed of plastic, and then you have the raised bed and you put soil in it, will this prevent contaminants?
Right. So for most, yes, that's oftentimes, so when you're building a raised bed, if you know the native soil is contaminated, you want to put some sort of barrier. But the thing is that you want to make sure that the water can go through. So plastic is not a great solution because you need to let the rainwater infiltrate. So you want to get some other type of landscape, line it with some other type of landscape fabric that's going to allow the water to drain, but the roots are not going to come into contact with that native soil. And you want to build your raised bed so that it's at least, a foot off the ground. Typical root depth, for example, like a tomato plant is like 6-8 inches at least, if that's what you're growing. If you're just growing kale or a spinach or something that has shallow roots, then your raised beds don't have to be as high. But yeah, putting a barrier down is definitely important, but I wouldn't go with plastic because you want it to drain.
Okay, thank you. So there's another question. I grow winter rye in my raised beds. How can I also cover?
So, okay, that is a great, I'm so glad that that question was asked. If you were growing a cover crop in your raised beds, then that is fine and you do not need to cover. But I would also say that you probably do not want to incorporate. You probably don't want to incorporate that rye into the bed. You could just cut it. You could cut the leafy portion off and then dispose of it. So, you know, if you don't do this 1 year, it may be okay, but year after year after year, you have all that dust. This is if you are growing in an area, an urban area where where there's known lead contamination in the soil. You know, you don't necessarily want to incorporate that cover crop into the bed. I know I know the whole reason for growing a cover crop is so that you can then incorporate that. But in this case, you probably don't want to do that.
Okay, so that's all the questions I have at the moment.
Okay.
We'll see if anything else pops up, but thank you, Michelle. That was a really great presentation and very informative. So everybody, hopefully you'll join us next week for our continuation of Earth Day Every Day in the City. We will be talking about combined sewer overflows and stormwater. And yeah, please take a minute and take that poll. I see we're still missing a couple folks. Make sure you hit submit. And everybody, let's thank Michelle. There's lots of comments coming in. Thank you, Michelle. We appreciate
No problem.
you.
Thank you guys for joining us.
Yeah, so we'll leave that poll open for a couple minutes. And yeah, thank you for joining us today. And hopefully we'll see you in the future. I will stop the recording.